Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to welcome today Jocelyn Jekel of Martin Saints Classical School for this episode of Scala's Love of Learning series, where we focus on exemplary educators. Scala's mission is to preserve and extend the classical liberal arts model of education. And one of the things we like to do is show particular educators in a variety of different contexts who have adapted the long tradition of liberal arts education, focusing on the whole person, mind, body, and soul, and see what does that look like in terms of setting up a curriculum, recruiting students, and having a transformative education that students then carry on into their own environments, their peers, and their future education. So I am Margarita Mooney. I'm the founder and executive director of Scala, and I'm also a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I'm teaching a class on Christianity and the liberal arts tradition. So as part of this ongoing dialogue about what is the liberal arts tradition, how does it become embodied and practiced in a variety of contexts, I invited Jocelyn today to tell us a little bit, first of all, about the mission and the history of Martin Saints Classical School. Could you tell us the mission and also the history of the school?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here. I'm happy to speak with your class. So Martin Saints Classical High School, many places we could start. I'll start with, we opened our doors in the fall of 2017 with just one ninth grade class. And then each year, as they've moved up in a grade, we've added, the new grade beneath them. So this spring is a very exciting time. This will be the first graduating class of Martin Saints, the class of 2021. And this is also our first year as a full 4-year high school since we began in 2017. Our name comes from, it's not St. Martin's, it's intentionally Martin Saints, because we are named after Louis and Zélie and Thérèse Martin. So Louis and Zélie were a married couple. They had many children, and perhaps their most famous child was their daughter, Thérèse of Lisieux, also known as the Little Flower. And both Thérèse of Lisieux was canonized and both of her parents were canonized. So it would be like the Mooney Saints or the Burt Saints or the Tenney Saints. It's the Martin Saints, this family of saints. And that, I think, is kind of the foundation of our mission. The school came about because there were a group of families whose children had received, either through homeschooling or through a Catholic school, this really beautiful classical education up through 8th grade. And then looking in the greater Philadelphia area, there just didn't seem to be an equally robust classical Catholic option for high school. And so it was families who got together with this mission and vision about educating the whole person. Quickly, we found the Chesterton Schools Network, which is a national network of classical Catholic high schools. There's, I think, 30 high schools now that are part of this network. So that is where we not only get support in terms of marketing and enrollment, but also where the foundation of our curriculum comes from. And so our students take a lot of different subjects: math and science, philosophy, history, literature, and theology. They study the fine arts and art and music, learn how to sing in a choir and how to paint, and also attend to the history of those topics. And we even offer craftsmanship classes where the students work through units of woodworking or fiber arts or cooking or outdoor education. We begin every school year with a camping and canoeing trip. 9 times throughout the year, roughly once a month, we go on a field trip out into the world. We call them Frassati Fridays, after Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. He was a patron of the arts and an avid outdoorsman and a servant of the poor. And those are kind of the 3 categories of what our trips consist of at our school. So we're going out into the outdoors, or we're going down to Kensington and serving lunch to the homeless and praying with them. Or we're going to an orchestra rehearsal or going to tour an art museum, that kind of thing. And I think all of that is just a snapshot of, we want our students to see that the world is good and God made it, and that it is big and beautiful, and that the Catholic Church is a compelling witness to that truth, and that there's just so much to learn and to wonder at, and to care about. And that's ultimately why we're doing what we're doing.
That's wonderful. Now, Could you tell me about yourself and how you came to Martin Saints? What is your educational background, your K to 12 education, your higher education, and how did you get involved with Martin Saints, and what do you do for them now?
Yeah. So I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I went to public school, K to 12. My father was actually the principal of my high school. He's still principal there. And had a really positive educational experience. I ended up going to the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University for my undergraduate degree. And I studied biochemistry. At the time, I wanted to be a doctor. But then I fell in love with the great books, and I fell in love with the professors who were teaching in the philosophy and theology departments. And I found through my undergraduate years, I had more questions about how to teach science well, how to teach science to the whole person. As I was studying science myself, but then experiencing all of these amazing seminar discussions in my humanities classes and reading these fantastic texts. So ultimately, I found myself just not being drawn to the questions of medicine and more so being drawn to the questions of education. So I took my first teaching job at a K to 8 classical Christian school out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I taught there for 2 years, a whole variety of subjects and grades. And that was just really jumping. There's no way to learn how to teach except by teaching. And so you just jump into the deep end and you figure it out. And that was a really wonderful experience. And as I guess it was the spring of 2017, I was ready to return to the East Coast. As much as I enjoyed the skiing and the hiking and the biking out there, I wanted to get back to the Philly area. And I had met Deacon Chris Roberts when I was in undergrad through, he had given a lecture at Eastern about some Catholic bioethics topics. And I heard they were looking for a science teacher. They were starting this new Catholic school and they needed a science teacher and a philosophy teacher. So I got hired to teach biology and philosophy my first year. And that was a really wonderful experience. And then just a few months into the school year, they found themselves in need of a director of classical education. You know, they sort of at our school currently, we have the 3 administrators, a headmaster, the director of classical education, which is my role, and then the president of the board. And founding a school is everyone, you know, get involved and get your hands dirty and do what you can. And so it's sort of been the 3 of us as administrators tag teaming it these past few years. And so in my role as director of classical education, I focus on curriculum, on teacher formation, so on observing teachers and giving them feedback, on leading our monthly faculty meetings, which also includes tapping other teachers, you know, asking them to give a presentation or lead us in a seminar discussion, and just generally overseeing all academic affairs at the school. So that's what I am currently doing. And most of the years I've been there, I've also taught a class or 2, but this year, I was telling Margarita at the beginning, I have a 1-year-old who also keeps me busy. So I'm mainly focusing on my 1-year-old and my role as administrator, as director of classical education.
That's wonderful. So you came in teaching biology and philosophy. That caught my attention first.
Yeah.
And I'd like to relate that to the broader issue of the curriculum. So I wondered if you, as in your role now as director of the classical curriculum, oftentimes a classical curriculum is described in terms of the content covered, right? A certain amount of Roman and Greek, Greek philosophy, ancient Rome, the history of Western literature and philosophy. Other times, a classical tradition is understood, and I think these are related, as integrating a varieties of fields of knowledge. So you don't hear often someone say, I teach biology and philosophy, but that's, in a way, I would like you to explain if that's part of the classical or the liberal arts part of the classical education. So if you could explain to us a little bit the philosophy of your curriculum, and then maybe perhaps some of the particulars. But what does it mean to teach a classical education? And what does it mean to teach a liberal arts education across a variety of subjects?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the $1 million question. I've been, I was completing a master's program through the Templeton Honors College, specifically in classical education. And, you know, we had a few online courses, but 2 summer sessions, and almost every class we would always say, but what is classical education? And it's one of those things that kind of resists definition because there's so much you could say about it. So it's not that it in and of itself is unclear or undefinable, but there's just so much to be said. The best working definition that we came up with is that a classical education is an education that seeks to form students to love, to recognize and to love whatever is good and true and beautiful, and to recognize and reject whatever is false and evil and ugly. And there's this beautiful tradition of people throughout history who have been asking, what is a human person and what is the best way to educate them? And how do we educate them in such a way that they know there's beauty and we can come to love it, and there's good and we can come to do it, and there's truth and we can come to believe it more clearly, more truly. And so you find that in the realists of the Greek and the Roman tradition, and you find that, in some of the monastery schools, and you find that in the university movement. And so you begin to see just this across the centuries, so many conversation partners asking the question, what is a human person and how do we educate that person? So as far as the philosophy of our curriculum, we want it to be this broad, this liberal curriculum, because part of what we're doing is kind of witnessing to the fact that all truth is God's truth. And so biology can point to the glory of God just as, clearly as philosophy and theology can point to the glory of God. We also want to help our students live good lives, and that starts now. That's not just something that we're preparing them for, and it will start when they graduate high school or when they graduate college or when they get their first job. And so we want them to spend their time doing things that are worthwhile and reading things that are worthwhile and encountering worthwhile works of art and music and science and math and so on and so forth. And so that also kind of guides the choices in our curriculum as far as what books are we reading, and why do we focus on the pieces of art or music or philosophy that we focus on. We're kind of agreeing with, I think it's C.S. Lewis's introduction to Athanasius's On the Incarnation, where he talks about, like, we want to pay careful attention to those books that have stood the test of time, because we can be more sure that those will be worth our time. It's not that nothing worthwhile has been written in 2020 or in the past decade, but that we might need a little bit more time to really be sure that this would be worth our time to read this book in this sacred space of the classroom. And so with all that being said, I think one of the things that teachers at Martin Saints do so beautifully is they kind of model for their own students what it looks like to be a lifelong learner and what it looks like to be well read across many different subjects and to have many different, passions and interests. And so, we have teachers who teach Spanish and philosophy, or biology and philosophy, or literature and history and theology, and, even incorporating different elements into different classes. I used to start every science class by reciting a poem with the students. And I think that if students are whole persons, we're educating them as whole persons. Teachers are whole persons too, and we want that to be on display for our students. And one of the ways we can do that is by having teachers teach multiple subjects and incorporate, integrate various subjects kind of with each other. Final way we do that is, I think, just by a faculty being locked together in conversation. So reading texts together and discussing those texts together, and having not seeing every classroom as its own island that isn't in conversation with each other, but getting together regularly. So it's hard to water down or to kind of narrow in on this is the philosophy behind our curriculum, when I think there are so many different factors that all come together in why we've made the curriculum choices that we've made. And like I said, a lot of it has been inherited from the Chesterton Schools Network. Some of the things like craftsmanship classes have been our own addition. But yeah, that's an attempt at an answer to the question.
Well, that was a great answer. And I have a couple of follow-up questions. One would be about sort of the terminology that's often used with classical education. Classical education, or frankly, liberal arts education, is often framed as Western or Western civilization. And one of the discussions that always comes up when I teach this class is classical education or is liberal arts education somehow restricted to classics of the Western tradition. And so I wonder, has that come up in your discussions? And if so, how do you think about the classical tradition as possibly including other kinds of traditions that may not be specifically Western?
Yeah, it's absolutely come up. I'd say this year, more than any year before, we've been asking, and once we hit this year, okay, we finally have all 4 grades. This is now our 4th time teaching 9th grade and our last time teaching a grade for the first time, right? So our last time teaching this new 12th grade for the first time. And it's kind of allowed us to take a breath and then to ask, okay, what are the big questions that we need to continue to ask together as a faculty? And at the very top is, how do we avoid ignoring the East when the East has so many important contributions, not only to education, but also to Christianity? I think sometimes we live we forget that there's a whole history and living reality of the church in the East. And even, the Catholic Church is not only the Roman Catholic Church, but there are all sorts of rites and just a diversity of traditions in the East as well in the church. And so we want to balance all of that, making sure that the students are aware of that they don't understand the church to be a purely Western institution. If they don't understand, the sequence of their education as only paying attention to the West. But that's in tension with, you're never going to be able to do everything. So any curriculum at any grade level, whether we're talking K-8 or high school or any college class, you always need to make decisions about, well, what are we going to spend most of our time on? What are we going to focus on? And what are we going to maybe mention, but we won't have time to go into as much depth as we would like to. And that's a question that we're still figuring out together as a faculty and as a school, because there are really beautiful works from the East. There are epic works from the East. There are works that deal with these big questions about the human condition and the nature of reality and the meaning of a good life, just as much in the East as they are in the West. And so we've been having a lot of conversations, especially in our history and philosophy and literature classes and departments, about how can we make room for some of those texts that we really do deserve the title of a great book, that are dealing with these important questions and these great ideas that are worth dwelling on, while also keeping a coherence and a kind of chronological approach that we have in our curriculum. So I don't have a beautiful success story of here's how you do it, but only to agree wholeheartedly that it needs to be asked and it certainly needs to be done. And classical education is not only for the West. I think it's going to be really interesting to see in the coming decades how this movement of a renewal in classical education, the liberal arts, isn't limited only to, America and what's going on here. So
that's fascinating. As I've been giving these talks and talking with people about what does it mean to do classical education or liberal arts education, I'm really interested, and Scala is really interested in paying attention to the context in which one educates. So one example, if you were to found a classical school, it just comes to mind, right? In Minneapolis, which has a large population from Ethiopia, one might want to intentionally look for aspects of the tradition of the community that is immigrated there that could be thought of as expressing the culture of excellence and the intellectual history of another part of the world. And there's a Scala advisor, a faculty advisor to Scala, Hank Edmondson, who teaches on the liberal arts tradition in China. And he works with a school that teaches Chinese classical civilization and the Western tradition of the liberal arts together, and teaching the students both, right? So sometimes what has been argued, at least in higher ed where I teach, is that because the liberal arts tradition, for the most part, let's admit it, has been taught as the Western tradition, and there's a canon, and we have to maintain this canon, then in order to promote diversity and talk about other cultures, it's led to a dismantling of the canon or a dismantling of the idea that there is a core curriculum. And so what I like about your approach or some of the other approaches that I've heard of is that one can maintain that there is something of a set of books that have shaped Western civilization that should be encountered, while also acknowledging that books and ideas from other cultures have shaped civilizations that have had amazing religious flourishing, and as you put it, the true, the good, and the beautiful,
Right.
and to be intentional about looking for those traditions and presenting them as worthwhile of study, as worthwhile of approaching, even if it's not one's own culture. So I think that's a wonderful thing. And could you give an example of a book or a piece of art or something that you think represents perhaps an Eastern classical tradition?
Yeah. Oh, I wish I had more off the top of my head. I was talking with a friend of mine who's worked in classical education for decades, and he was telling me about a text. I think it's a Confucian text, and I can't remember the name of it. But the conversation was about how classical educators don't need to be afraid of texts in the East, because the main point of classical education is not that we're Western, but that we believe in the existence of truth and goodness and beauty. We believe in the ability of human beings to come to know and believe and love those things more clearly. And so no one culture or no one civilization has a monopoly on that task or has a monopoly on that endeavor. And so we can see texts from China and India and even Ethiopia and other, I know there's a great epic, I think originally written in Mali, that one of my teachers was telling me about, as like, hey, could we add this epic? You know, we read the Iliad and the Odyssey, so why not incorporate this other epic that no one knows about barely, but it's super interesting, and there's so many questions to be engaged with in the classroom with this type of book. So yeah, I think this is an area where we're just starting to dig deeper and to scratch the surface, but I think it's absolutely work that can and should be done by more teachers at more schools.
Well, look, I'm keeping a list of unanswered questions or new questions every time I teach this course, but I would just say that I think that what you're doing and what we're talking about is a way of assisting the internationalization of education. And in some ways, we now live in a global world and people are all accessing materials, but there's a way in which the classical liberal arts tradition doesn't have to replace another tradition as it spreads. It can actually perhaps help other traditions recover their own
Right.
classics and recover their own traditions, which is what I understand the classical Chinese school is doing. They're teaching classical Chinese civilization in a way that most Chinese schools aren't doing. And they've
Yeah.
been inspired by the classical education system of coming out of the United States to rediscover a tradition that got replaced by a largely STEM focused education in China. And so I think that the image of dialogue, as you set out before, right, that this is a journey of discovery, and
Right.
the Western tradition, it frankly is the starting point of most liberal arts schools and curriculums, but it can be a starting point that's open and can bring out aspects of other traditions that may have been lost, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's fantastic. I wanted to ask, well, then, just I guess staying on the curriculum, what if you could tell us a little bit about the sequence, right? Like, how do you decide? Because this is another question that's come up. Liberal arts people hear of the quadrivium and the trivium. There's certain subjects that need to be covered and the ordering of it. So just could you give us like an overview now that you're a 4-year high school, right? What is in brief, 4-year high school path for a student at Martin Saints? And could you also include the rationale for the types of experiential learning you mentioned, the canoeing, the service, and the field trips? Like, how does that, and the crafts, how do those kinds of experiential educational things fit into the larger vision of the curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll start with kind of the overview of what we do and when we do it. So there's, for the most subjects follow a kind of chronological theme for the year. So the theme of freshman year is the ancient world. And it's not solely ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but I would say that's the highlight or sort of the emphasis of the year. And So in philosophy class, that's where they're reading several of Plato's dialogues. In history class, that's where they're reading Herodotus and some Plutarch. In literature class, that's where they're reading the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and some of the Greek tragedies. And it's not perfect, but even something like science, our science course freshman year is an astronomy and physical science class. And there's quite a bit that the ancients knew about astronomy. They would put us to shame. We might have computers in our pockets that can allow us to see stars in the sky, but they just could identify stars, and they could, know so many things about astronomy and the cosmos. And so even in science class, our students are able to read some of those original texts and learn about what the ancients knew about the cosmos. Sophomore year, we move into the medieval period. So our students, they read Confessions and Song of Roland. In philosophy class, we sort of linger a little bit more with Plato and Aristotle, because they're such an important foundation for really all of philosophy following them. But literature and history are kind of continuing on with the medieval theme. And then junior year is focusing on the early modern period, the Renaissance, and then senior year focusing on American history. Not entirely up to the present day, but within just a few decades. And so it's not perfect. For example, in our theology classes, they study the Old Testament in freshman year and the New Testament in sophomore year. And that doesn't perfectly connect with kind of the chronological theme or the chronological sequence of those years. But what we found is that there are lots of other really important connections to be made. So for example, in sophomore year, when the theme, if you will, of the year is medieval, the medieval world, they're reading the New Testament. New Testament's not the medieval world, but the New Testament is the story of Christ's resurrection and then instituting the church. And there's quite a lot to be talked about with the development of the church in the medieval period. And our science for that year is 10th grade biology. And there's so many beautiful connections to be made between the resurrection of the body and actually examining the glory and wonder of the body. And so at the beginning of the year, each kind of grade level meets together, and we have an hour-long discussion about what are some of those maybe surprising connections that you wouldn't immediately see, like, oh, well, it's ancient philosophy, so of course we're reading Plato. But oh, so we're talking about the resurrection in theology class, and then we're also going to talk about theology of the body in biology class, and we're also going to talk about these important topics in history class, and make these own connections for the students. So there are many different ways to design a high school curriculum. I know a lot of classical schools that actually begin freshman year with American history, and their rationale is kind of that's the most recent era of history. It's almost the most accessible to the students in a certain way. And then from there, they kind of circle back to ancients, medievals, and then modern. The nice thing about kind of just plugging through from ancient to present day is the chronological consistency of it. It does mean that our freshmen are reading really difficult ancient Greek texts. It does mean that as a freshman, you're just diving right into Homer and you're diving right into Plato. But I also think that our students are often pleasantly surprised by how much they love Homer and Plato, and how accessible these great authors actually end up being. So that's a quick kind of snapshot of the curriculum order. As for the other parts of our curriculum, our Friday Fridays and our craftsmanship classes and our canoe trip, our school motto is the Saint Irenaeus quote, "The glory of God is man fully alive." And so when the founders of our school got together and started dreaming about what do we want in a high school, well, if we recognize that our students are whole persons, they're not just brains on a stick, and they're not just vessels to be crammed with information, but they're a person and their body and soul, then we need to attend to all the different facets of being a person, the spiritual and the intellectual and the physical. And so one of the ways that I think the Friday field trips, especially our corporal works of mercy service trips, came about was that kind of attention to the spiritual realm, that attending to the spiritual realm of our students isn't just having mass or prayer. And we do have those things every day in our school day, but it's also going out into the world and practicing the corporal works of mercy. We've attended March for Life, and this year we're doing a creative kind of online conference of sorts, having a variety of people kind of zoom in and speak to our students about issues of life and death and what the Catholic Church has to say about all of that. But it's kind of that all is very much part of our mission of being a Catholic school that's committed to helping our students see what it looks like to be a fully alive Catholic. We often say, like, we're not conservative Catholics, we're not liberal Catholics, we're not Democrat Catholics, we're not Republican Catholics, we're catechism Catholics, we're Catholic Catholics. We care about the environment, and we care about, the Catholic Church's teaching on sexual ethics, and we care about the poor, and we care about, just economic policy and all of these different parts of upholding the truth in those areas. And even something like our commitment to the outdoors, the canoe trip and the Friday excursions to the outdoors, I think that kind of comes from, if we want our students to actually believe that creation is beautiful, that the world is good, and that God made an ordered and knowable world that we not only get to enjoy, but that we're called to steward, then we need to give them experiences in the great outdoors where they actually canoe and camp or garden or, so on and so forth. We once went on a Friday trip with a professional forager who taught us to find like edible plants and, fend for ourselves out in the wild. It was super fun. But I think all of it is that kind of broadening the students' imagination about what is the world full of and what is possible, as far as my own life is concerned, the ways that I can spend my time and the ways that I can do good work in the world. And I think all of those things testify to the glory of God, that we see that in creation, and we see that in the Mass, and we see that in the least of these, and we see that in the beautiful architecture of churches and the beautiful works of art and the beautiful works of music that we can see at the Philadelphia Orchestra. I guess what I haven't touched on yet is our craftsmanship class, so why teach woodworking and why teach fiber arts? And I don't know if woodworking in and of itself is essential to a classical education. I would argue that I think it is. I think it's a really wonderful thing for students to actually learn. But certainly crafts of some kind are an important part of a student's education. I think we've lost touch with the physical world in so many ways. It's wonderful that I can see all of you on my computer screen right now, but there's also something kind of odd and disembodied about it, that I can't actually see your three-dimensional body in the same room, and that we can't, hear one another's voices. And I think there are all sorts of ways in our modern world where we see this kind of separation between the physical and the spiritual, but that's what we are. We're body and soul united into one being. And I think teaching the crafts in a school, teaching woodworking, or teaching students how to knit or how to cook. We include drama as one of our units of craftsmanship. That kind of commitment to learning how to make something or how to do something with your own hands is something that our students often aren't just naturally going to do on their own. There are so many other temptations of how they can spend their time with screens. And so we only have control from the time they walk into the school until the time that they leave. And we want them to spend their time doing beautiful and worthwhile things. And we believe that learning how to make a bench in woodworking class is actually a great thing they can do. Joseph Pieper, I think, is a wonderful conversation partner about the liberal arts and about what education is. And he talks so beautifully about all the virtues, right? Prudence and temperance and courage and so on and so forth. But I found in reading his writings on prudence, he makes the argument that in order to cultivate the virtue of prudence, really you need some habits, kind of prerequisite habits, before you can cultivate that virtue. And one of the most essential habits is the habit of attention, the habit of savoring things as they really are. And I think whether it's reading a poem really closely or observing, a microscopic slide in biology class, or attending to a piece of wood and how you can form it into something else in woodworking class. All of these different activities are ways of training our students to practice and strengthen the habit of attention. And that's something that, in my experience in classical circles, over and over again, people emphasize that classical teachers, you don't teach math or literature or philosophy. Like, you teach virtue. That is what you teach. You teach your students virtue, and you do that by helping them cultivate certain habits. And I think the habit of attention is an excellent one to start with, that we get to see in our craftsmanship classes and in our Versati Fridays, attending to this particular person. And allowing that person to also show you the love of Christ, allowing yourself to be surprised by that encounter. Those are just all experiences that our students aren't getting otherwise. And so we think those are worthwhile. We want them to be part of our school.
That's fascinating, because what I hear as you're describing things, I hear you both in your curriculum, you have an attention to the content of the curriculum, the books, the subjects of knowledge, but there's been a lot of reflection on the approach to the teaching, and also, just as you say, the cultivation of habit and virtue, and what does that take? And then linking something like craftsmanship. I mean, it's easy to think of craftsmanship, building something, in a purely utilitarian sense. Like, you're teaching somebody a skill. And what I hear you saying is that crafts and technical manual trades, let's say, they can be a skill, but they also develop the person as a person who can pay attention, as a person who has virtue. And I think of one book I often teach. So on the one hand, I teach the Benedictine tradition, of which manual labor is a really important part. And then I pair that with something more contemporary, Matthew Crawford, The Work Inside of Your Head. And he makes the point that, as Jacques Maritain says in Education at a Crossroads, one of the temptations, especially in the United States, is to associate education with intellectualism, with just filling your head with knowledge. But really, the end of knowing something is to be able to live a good life. And so what Crawford says is that intellectualism has led people to think that someone like him, who has a PhD in philosophy from Chicago, is really smart, and somebody who's an auto mechanic, just isn't that smart. Where he actually says doing work with your hands it is bringing something into being that wasn't there. You're making an object, but you're actually learning and forming yourself. You're forming the virtue of attention, but you're also, as you said, with all of your examples of going outside, you're looking at how nature actually works and how we interact with nature to build something. And that itself is actually very intellectually taxing work.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, who would you say are some of your philosophers or writers on education that have influenced you? Have you read, for example, Charlotte Mason, or have you? Oh, okay. Can you tell us a little bit about Charlotte Mason and how she's influenced your views of education?
Definitely. So I also, when I moved back to Philly, in addition to being involved at Martin Saints, I taught at a Charlotte Mason homeschool academy. And that was only one day a week, but it was amazing. It was really, really lovely. And so I've been, I guess, for the past 4 years, reading Mason, with a group of women in this area, and kind of learning more about her and her work and her educational philosophy. I think Charlotte Mason is an incredibly important conversation partner for anyone who's thinking about what is a human person and what does it mean to educate them. She's a woman who just committed her entire life to education. She was orphaned at a fairly young age. I think by the time she was 18, maybe even 16, she was teaching. And as she was teaching, as she was boots on the ground in charge of children, she started taking notes, and she started paying attention to what was working and what wasn't working. And she lived, I think, into her 80s. And so just over the course of her life, she taught extensively. She developed a teacher training college called Ambleside. She sort of launched this movement of parents in the country of England who kind of continued her work. So the Parents National Education Union, the PNEU, who continued to write articles and essays. She wrote 6 volumes, and it wasn't just all about in the classroom education. It was about kind of the whole of life. So one of her volumes is all about parents and children. One of them is this cool kind of like guide to your inner self. It's called Ourselves, and it's written both for students and for teachers to almost familiarize themselves with the terrain of being a human person, right? That you have conflicting desires in you, and there's some good and there's some bad, and life is learning how to navigate these parts of yourself in different scenarios. So I think what Charlotte Mason gives us is this really fleshed out philosophy of what does it mean that children are born persons. She has, I think, 20 or so foundational principles. And then it's from those principles that, her methodology flows. And I hear educators talk, I've used this phrase several times already in this presentation, that children are persons and we are persons. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And Charlotte Mason is a practitioner who spent so much time and just gives so many amazing reflections on what it actually means that children are born persons. It means that we can, from a very young age, tell children a story and ask them to tell it back to us in their own words. And this is what narration is. And in the course of narrating this story back to the teacher, they're not just regurgitating the information, they're also processing it. They're also, their mind is kind of feeding on these living ideas in this story, and they're engaging with it. And so, sometimes you get the heavily strict Dorothy Sayers model of classical education, that you've got, the 3 stages, grammar, logic, rhetoric. And since those little kids are just so darn good at memorization, we're just going to make sure they memorize everything when they're really little at that grammar stage. And Charlotte Mason says, yeah, they're good at memorization, but they're also good at marveling at stories. And they're also good at paying attention to butterflies and plants. And we should be doing all of these things as part of our educating them as persons. I think with the class, I think there are so many wonderful conversation partners in thinking about education and the liberal arts. And we can go back to Plato and Aristotle and St. Benedict and John Henry Newman and G.K. Chesterton and Joseph Pieper and so on and so forth. But I also think that what Charlotte Mason gives us is this kind of body of work that the body of work in the liberal arts tradition is almost so huge that we can have very different schools that pop up in this classical or liberal arts tradition that end up looking very different in terms of the books that they've chosen, and especially the method of education that they follow. Whereas what Mason does is she gives, I think, a much more clear methodology. Whether you disagree with her or not, at least it's clear what it looks like to teach a lesson and to ask the students to do a narration, and how to lead a picture study, having the students look at a piece of art and talk about it, or how to lead nature study or composer study. If you're the kind of person who appreciates the kind of it's all together and it's all a coherent living method and philosophy, then that's where Charlotte Mason is really helpful. And I think she is part of this movement of people asking, what is a human person and how do we educate them? And so, she's certainly a part of the classical education tradition or the liberal arts education tradition. Though she does have kind of this distinct following of people who are very committed to Charlotte Mason. So.
Well, I'm going to add that to my list of resources to include and to share with people, because this actually has come up in my class this semester, that there's a lot of discussion about discussion and dialogue in the classroom. But I heard you use the word storytelling, and that has now come up with my students, thinking about in what ways does a teacher model and invite students into telling a story? Right. And so I think that some of the examples you gave, that we don't only study nature, we actually think about it in context and tell a story and narrate. So I think that that's a really important way of broadening the discussion around the methods of liberal arts education to storytelling, narration. Absolutely. And it's part of the philosophy of the person that I teach in one of my classes. Human beings are storytellers, right? And in some ways, this is controversial, but in some ways, science itself is a narrative, right? It's seeing things, but not everything about science is visible. Gravity isn't visible, right?
Yeah.
So, the story of the Grand Canyon, I mean, it's based on what we're observing and it's based on what we're inferring based on what we're observing. And so
Yeah.
to think about even science as a narrative, to be a good scientist, you have to be a good storyteller in a way. You also need to know the lab science and the reductionism, but there's such a reductionism in STEM fields that I think that science as story might not, maybe it won't get you a job, but it should. So just, that's a good title for something, science as
There
story.
you go. Yeah. One of you can take that on as a project someday.
Right.
any of
Well,
any
because
of
as
you
soon as you
science
say
teachers.
storytelling, people go to the humanities, but thinking about all fields of knowledge are part of a story, I think is what I was getting at. So I'm going to add Charlotte Mason to the list of resources that I recommend people look into. So thank you for that, because you mentioned many of the others that I teach: John Henry Newman, Jack Maritain. We teach Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, John Dewey. And I think, again, what I hope to do, and thank you for joining us today, I hope to expose students to different understandings that complement each other. Sometimes I think they're saying different things,
Right.
but I think it's important to read the most influential writers who thought philosophically about education and educational methods. And then, as you said, putting together a school and a curriculum, you end up needing to draw on a variety of sources. There's not one, there's not one playbook here. And I think that's also really important.